These three disturbing small-town horror stories are inspired by real events. First, a skier vanishes from the center of a frozen lake without leaving a single track in the snow. 500 days later, he suddenly reappears with no memory of where he has been or how he survived. Next, a woman goes missing from her home in the middle of the night. The only witness to the crime is a parked Tesla, which recorded a grainy, dark figure dragging a heavy bag down the driveway. Finally, miners in Oklahoma blast open a sealed underground chamber and accidentally let something ancient out into the world. Make sure you watch until the very end to see the terrified message the first victim wrote in the dust right before he died. On February 20th, 1975, Oliver skied into the center of a frozen lake and vanished without leaving a single footprint to walk away. He reappeared 500 days later and 700 miles from the ice, wearing tailored work pants he had never purchased and possessing no memory beyond the moment he stepped onto the snow. This impossibility is the signature of the Michigan Triangle. Locals know that the stretch of water from Ludington to Benton Harbor doesn't play by the rules of the rest of the world. It is a hungry place. In 1950, Flight 2501 vanished from radar over these waters with 58 people on board. No wreckage was ever found, just shredded remains washing ashore. In 1891, the schooner Thomas Hume sailed into a fog bank and simply ceased to exist, only to be found a century later sitting perfectly upright on the lake floor. It hadn't sunk. It had just stopped. Oliver walked right into this history on February 20th, 1975. He was 23, an intellectual who preferred German books to loud parties. He wasn't reckless. He drove his car to the edge of the lake near Saugatuck to clear his head before the spring semester. The lake was a flat, white desert frozen solid for miles. The wind had scrubbed the ice clean, leaving a surface as hard as concrete. Oliver clipped into his cross-country skis, planted his bamboo poles, and pushed off toward the gray horizon. He planned for a quick trip. The lake had other plans. When he didn't return by nightfall, the panic set in. By the next morning, the police and volunteers were on the ice. They found his car frozen in the lot. Then they found the trail. The tracking was easy. The snow was pristine, and Oliver's ski tracks cut a straight line away from the shore. The search team followed them for miles. The wind screamed around them, but the tracks were clear. Then the lead officer stopped dead. There, sitting on top of the ice, were Oliver's skis. They were placed neatly side by side. His bamboo poles were stuck upright in the snow next to them. The search team looked around in every direction. The ice was unbroken. There was no hole. There was no water. The surface was thick enough to hold a truck. Oliver's footprints led right up to the bindings of the skis, and then they simply vanished. There were no footprints leading away, no slide marks, no blood, no signs of a struggle. It looked as if he had stepped out of his skis and been plucked straight into the sky. The search dogs hit the site and immediately began to whine. They paced in circles, confused, because Oliver's scent didn't fade away. It was cut off. The police wrote accidental drowning on the report because they couldn't write abducted by the air. 3 hours north in Boyne City, Oliver's father waited. He sat by a phone that refused to ring. He watched the winter turn to spring and the spring turn to summer. Finally, he accepted the silence. He packed up Oliver's books. He folded Oliver's clothes. He held a funeral service at the local church with an empty casket. To the town, Oliver was just another ghost of the Triangle. 17 months passed. 500 days of silence. The world moved on. Then on July 5th, 1976, the impossible happened again. 700 miles away in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, a man woke up in the middle of a grassy field. He gasped for air, his chest heaving like he had just finished a sprint. He was sweating. He was disoriented. The summer sun beat down on his neck. It was Oliver. He stood up, dizzy. He looked down at his body, and the horror began to set in. He was wearing clothes he didn't own. The t-shirt was strange. The heavy work pants fit him perfectly, as if they had been tailored for his legs, but he had never seen them before in his life. He was gripping a leather satchel that wasn't his. Inside, he found maps of cities he didn't know. In Oliver's mind, it was still February. In his mind, he was still on the ice in Michigan. He stumbled to a trash bin and pulled out a newspaper. The date stared back at him. July 5th, 1976. He dropped the paper. He had lost nearly 2 years of his life in a single blink. He had no memory of the wind, the sun, or the meals he must have eaten. He was a shell. Terrified, he hitched rides back to Michigan. He felt like an alien in his own life. When he finally walked up the gravel driveway in Boyne City, his father was on the porch. The old man froze. He saw a shadow moving toward him, a figure with a familiar walk. The son he had buried a year ago was walking home. The doctors examined him. They said he was healthy. They used words like dissociative fugue, claiming his brain had simply rebooted. They tried to explain it away with stress or amnesia. But medical textbooks don't explain the ice. They don't explain how a man leaves his skis in the center of a frozen lake without making a single footprint to leave. And that isn't the worst part. The real horror sits in the corner of Oliver's room in that leather bag. It's the maps. It's the strange clothes. If Oliver wasn't present for those 500 days, something else was. Something else wore his face. Something else spoke with his voice. Something else walked through strange cities, buying clothes and living a life, all while the real Oliver was suspended in the dark. He didn't just lose time. He was a passenger in his own body, and he will never know who or what was driving. Simon told the police he had been quarantined inside his home for 72 hours with COVID. A parked Tesla recorded him moving heavy black bags across the driveway while he was supposedly in bed. The motion-activated 4K Sentry Mode footage proved the bags held the weight of a human body. In the quiet coastal town of Darien, Connecticut, the winter air usually carries nothing but the scent of salt and wood smoke. It is the kind of place where neighbors wave to one another and doors are often left unlocked. But by December 2024, a different kind of atmosphere had settled over the home of Simon and Jacqueline. From the outside, the house looked perfect, a symbol of the American dream. Jacqueline was a successful biotech executive, the primary earner who powered their wealthy lifestyle. Simon, a landscape architect, was seen as the devoted father who stayed behind to mind the children. But the stillness inside that house had curdled into something else, a tense, waiting quiet that felt brittle enough to snap. On December 4th, that image of devotion began to fracture. Jacqueline hadn't shown up for a high-stakes investor meeting in Cambridge. It was unlike her. She was precise, punctual, and driven. Her colleagues called her phone, but it went straight to voicemail. By the afternoon, worry turned into panic, and the police were called for a welfare check. When the police cruiser rolled up to the house, the street was dead quiet. The engine of the police car idled with a low hum, cutting through the cold air. Officers walked up the driveway, their boots crunching on the frost-covered pavement. They rang the doorbell. The electronic chime echoed deep within the house, fading into the distance. For a long time, there was no movement, no footsteps, no dog barking, just a hollow, ringing emptiness, the kind of quiet that makes your own heartbeat sound too loud. Finally, the door opened, but only a tiny crack. A chain lock might have been in place, or maybe just a foot wedged behind it. Simon stood in the sliver of darkness. He was wearing a blue N95 mask that covered half his face. His eyes looked tired, or perhaps they were just watchful. "Officer, I can't let you in," he said. His voice sounded muffled and weak, dampened by the thick fabric of the mask. "I just tested positive for COVID this morning. I'm isolating from the kids." It was a brilliant move. In 2024, the word COVID still carried a specific power. It acted like a magic shield, a social do not disturb sign that forced the officers to instinctively step back from the porch. It triggered a biological reflex, the fear of sickness. It explained his disheveled appearance, the grease in his hair, and the unnatural stillness of the house. Most importantly, it gave him a flawless reason to refuse to let anyone inside to look around. The officers, respecting the health protocol, stepped back. They took his word for it. They left him alone in the house, with his secrets. But while Simon was allegedly bedridden, fighting a fever and struggling to breathe, the digital world was recording his every move. He thought he was invisible behind his mask, but he had forgotten that modern life is watched by 1,000 unblinking eyes. On the evening of December 3rd, the day before the police arrived, surveillance cameras at a Lowe's in Norwalk captured a man who looked nothing like a patient in respiratory distress. The fluorescent lights of the store buzzed overhead, casting a stark white glare on the polished concrete floors. The security footage shows a figure entering the store. He wore a heavy hoodie pulled up over his head, blue nitrile gloves that snapped tight against his wrists, and that same N95 mask. As he moved through the aisles, he weaponized the very fear he was hiding behind. He didn't just walk, he performed. He coughed loudly, a dry, rasping sound that echoed against the metal shelves. You can see other shoppers in the video hearing the sound. Their heads turn. They see the mask, the gloves, and hear the sickness. They actively move away, pulling their carts to the side, clearing a wide path for him. He used their fear of the virus to ensure no one would look too closely at his face. He created a bubble of isolation in a crowded store. He moved to the checkout with a cart full of heavy items. He paid $525 in cash, paper money that leaves no digital trail on a credit card statement. The list of items was specific, and to anyone paying attention, terrifying. A 12-gallon shop vac capable of sucking up wet debris, a steam mop for sanitizing hard surfaces, Tyvek painter's coveralls to protect clothing from stains, high-traffic carpet cleaner, and a hacksaw with replacement blades. The cashier scanned the items. The machine chirped with a rhythmic, mundane tone, a stark contrast to the grim potential of the tools on the belt. Simon didn't look like a man weak with illness. He moved with a cold, frantic energy. He lifted the heavy boxes into his cart without a single hint of physical weakness. His muscles worked efficiently. He was a man on a mission. Back at the house, Simon thought he was being careful. He was a landscape architect. He knew about dirt, and he knew about digging. He used his work truck to haul away evidence, driving to dumpsters in apartment complexes miles away. He knew his truck didn't have the same advanced GPS tracking as Jacqueline's luxury car. He thought he had covered his tracks, but he made one fatal mistake. He left Jacqueline's Tesla Model Y parked in the driveway. He treated the car like a piece of furniture, a silent object. He forgot that a Tesla is less like a car and more like a computer on wheels. It has cameras everywhere, on the bumpers, on the pillars, on the fenders, and it has a feature called Sentry Mode. When the car detects motion near it, it wakes up. It starts recording. In the dead of night, the driveway was pitch black. The wind rustled through the bare branches of the trees. Simon emerged from the house. He was dragging something. It was a bulging black contractor bag. The plastic of the bag scraped loudly against the asphalt. It was a harsh, rhythmic dragging sound in the dead air of the night. As he passed the Tesla, the car's computer brain flared to life. The side repeater camera blinked on, recording in crisp 4K resolution. It saw everything. The footage didn't just show a man taking out the trash. It showed the physics of the act. Simon wasn't coughing now. He wasn't hunched over in pain. He gripped the bag with strong hands. He was lifting a weight that detectives would later estimate was roughly 120 pounds, the exact weight of his missing wife. He lifted it with zero physical struggle, heaving it into the back of the truck with a dull, heavy thud. The Tesla watched him silently, its hard drive spinning, saving the evidence of his strength, proving his alibi was a lie. The final blow to his story came from the playroom. It wasn't a witness, and it wasn't a camera. It was a small, innocent device, an iPad belonging to Simon's son. Detectives eventually obtained a search warrant for the digital devices in the home. They opened the iPad and looked at the search history from the early hours of December 3rd. This was the window of time when Simon claimed he was sleeping off a high fever. The search history revealed the true internal monologue of the bedridden husband. It was a timeline of a panic evolving into a plan. At 4 a.m., the house would have been dark. The glow of the iPad screen would have illuminated Simon's face, casting long, strange shadows against the wall. His fingers tapped silently on the glass. His first question to Google was, "Does ammonia kill DNA?" He waited, reading the results, the lack of sound in the room amplifying the blood rushing in his own ears. 15 minutes later, at 4:15 a.m., he typed again, "Darien trash pickup schedule versus Stamford." He was calculating. He was trying to figure out how much time he had before the trucks came. By 5 a.m., the sun would still be down. The queries turned even more practical, more mechanical. How to dismantle a shop vac to hide evidence. He was looking for instructions on how to clean the machine he had just bought, or perhaps how to destroy it. And finally, as the morning light began to turn the sky gray, he typed the most chilling question of all. It was the question of a man who knew exactly what he had done and was looking for a loophole. Can you be charged with murder if body is never found? He wasn't searching for symptoms of COVID. He wasn't looking for flu remedies. He was researching how to get away with the unthinkable. Simon was eventually arrested at a Starbucks near his home. He was ordering a coffee, acting casual, perhaps thinking he had bought himself enough time. The police didn't take his word for it this time. They didn't step back. They approached him, ignoring his feigned cough and his protests, and placed him in handcuffs right there in front of the morning commuters. They took him to the station, stripping him of his mask and his freedom. During the booking process, under the harsh fluorescent lights of the intake room, medical staff administered the test he claimed he had already failed. The result came back 15 minutes later. Negative. One solid line. Simon hadn't been sick. He had been busy. He had used a global tragedy as a cloak to hide a private one. He had bet everything on the idea that a mask and a cough would be enough to keep the world at bay while he erased the woman who had built his life. He was a man who understood that sometimes the best way to hide a monster is to pretend you're a victim. But in the end, the technology he lived with, the car in the driveway, The iPad in the playroom betrayed him. The quiet facade of the house was broken, and the truth, grim and undeniable, was dragged out into the light. In December 1933, the Pocola miners used dynamite to blast 20 feet into a chamber in Spiro, Oklahoma, that had been sealed for 500 years. Soon after, the mayor died from an unknown infection. His hunting dog dropped dead without a mark, and the lead miner was found dead in a locked barn after writing, "The cat took my breath," in the dirt. The Oklahoma wind of the 1930s was not merely weather, it was a physical weight. It carried the red grit of a dying landscape, a constant dry hiss against the window panes that tasted of copper and desperation. In the small town of Spiro, 6 men, the Pocola Mining Company, were driven by that desperation to dig into the great mounds of the Arkansas River Valley. They weren't looking for history. They were looking for a way out of the Great Depression. Otis stood at the base of the great mortuary mound, watching the lead miner set the fuse. The men were rushing, their lease nearly up, and the air felt thick with the static of a coming storm. With a muffled thud that vibrated through the soles of Otis's boots, the dynamite buckled the clay wall. As the dust settled, a draft of air rushed out from the breach, a cold, heavy exhale that carried the scent of rotting cedar and something stagnant that had not tasted the sky in 5 centuries. They stepped into the Spirit Lodge, a hollow chamber filled with cedar poles and thousands of freshwater pearls piled like drifts of dirty snow. In the center sat a black stone box, its surface so smooth it felt alien against the rough, calloused hands of the miners. Otis reached for it, and as he lifted the lid, a sharp edge sliced deep into his palm. He didn't cry out, but the blood that dripped onto the stone was dark, almost black. He wrapped the wound in a sweat-stained handkerchief, unaware that he had just become the first host of something liberated from the deep. The camp that night was quiet, but it was a nervous silence. The wind had died down, leaving a heavy stillness that pressed against the ears. Otis sat by the fire, nursing his hand. The cut throbbed. It wasn't a normal pain. It felt like a heartbeat separate from his own, a slow, hot rhythm pulsing under the bandage. He looked at the other men. They weren't celebrating the pearls or the artifacts. They were looking at the darkness beyond the firelight, their eyes wide, as if they were waiting for something to step out of the shadows. By the next morning, the infection moved to its financier, Mayor Lester. Otis had brought the box to the mayor's office, and Lester's greedy fingers had spent hours tracing its edges. The following morning, the mayor nicked his cheek while shaving, a mundane, tiny cut. But by noon, the skin hadn't scabbed. It had turned the color of a bruised plum, swelling with a heat that felt like a localized fire. The town doctor diagnosed blood poisoning from the dust, but the medicine of 1933 was useless. The infection spread with a rhythmic, pulsing throb that mirrored the mayor's failing heart. The night the mayor died, the black roller hit. It was a dust storm of biblical proportions, a wall of red earth that turned the afternoon into an obsidian midnight. The friction of the dust generated massive amounts of static electricity. Outside, the barbed wire fences began to hum with a high-pitched metallic whine, glowing with a ghostly blue fire known as St. Elmo's fire. Inside the mayor's house, the air crackled. Every touch resulted in a painful spark, and the hair on the back of the neck stood on end. The mayor lay in his bed, his face unrecognizable, swollen and dark. His breathing was wet and ragged, the sound of a drowning man in a dry room. Otis stood in the corner of the room, feeling the static prickle his skin. The air smelled of ozone and dry earth, but underneath that, The smell of the tomb, that rotting cedar scent, was getting stronger. It was filling the house, choking out the smell of medicine and fear. At the exact moment the mayor took his final, rattling breath, a blue arc of static overloaded the town's transformer with a deafening crack. The entire town was plunged into a darkness so absolute it felt like being buried alive. In that void, the mayor's hunting dog, Blue, began to howl. It wasn't a warning. It was a scream of pure, primal terror. Then, the sound was cut short, as if a hand had been clamped over the beast's muzzle. For a long moment, nobody moved. The only sound in the blackness was the wind howling outside, a shriek that sounded like 1,000 voices screaming in unison. Someone finally struck a match. The flare of light was blinding for a second. When the kerosene lamps were finally lit, the mayor was cold. A few feet away, Blue lay dead. There wasn't a mark on the dog, no blood, no sign of struggle. His heart had simply stopped in the dark. The fear in Spiro began to curdle into madness. The town was small, and word traveled fast. People whispered that the mayor hadn't just died. Something had come for him. The lead miner, the man who had set the dynamite, began to claim he was being watched. He spoke of ghost cats, flickering, pale shapes that moved through the swirling dust of the storm. He said he saw them in the reflection of windows, low to the ground, with eyes that burned like the blue static fire. He retreated to his barn, locking the heavy timber door from the inside to keep the shadows out. He nailed planks over the gaps in the wood. He refused to sleep. His family could hear him pacing at night, the heavy thud of his boots on the straw-covered floor, back and forth, back and forth. He was muttering to himself, a low, frantic stream of words that made no sense. He kept saying the air was getting too heavy to breathe. 3 days later, they found him. The barn was silent, save for the dry scuttle of dust in the corners. The heavy door had to be broken down with an axe. The sound of the wood splintering echoed across the empty fields. The miner was slumped against the wall, his eyes wide and clouded with an unnameable horror. He hadn't used a rope. He hadn't used a blade. But in the fine layer of dust on the floor, he had traced a final, frantic sentence before the end. "I didn't do it. The cat took my breath." Otis stood in the doorway of the barn, looking at the dead man. He felt the throb in his hand, a dull ache that seemed to be pulling him back toward the mounds. He knew then that this wasn't an illness. It wasn't just bad luck. They had opened a door that was never meant to be opened, and something had walked through. He knew the cycle wouldn't stop until the box was returned. Under the shroud of a final, screaming wind, he carried the black stone box back to the mound. The walk was a nightmare. The wind pushed against him, trying to knock him down. The static was so intense, his clothes clung to his skin, and his vision was blurred by blue sparks. Every shadow looked like it was moving, shifting into the shape of a crouching beast. He could hear the whine of the barbed wire fences, a high singing note that sounded like a warning. He reached the edge of the pit. The spirit lodge was dark and silent below. The smell of cedar rose up to meet him, sickeningly sweet. Otis didn't hesitate. He threw the stone into the open pit. It vanished into the dark without a sound. Just as he turned away, the remaining miners set a massive charge of black powder to seal the site forever. The explosion was a visceral roar that collapsed the mound, burying the spirit lodge and the box under tons of red Oklahoma clay. The ground shook, and for a moment, the wind seemed to stop. The dust hung in the air, a red fog that slowly settled over the ruin. The fevers in town broke. The blood poisoning vanished as quickly as it had arrived. But the resolution was hollow. The Pocola miners had gotten what they wanted. They had looted the history of the Arkansas River Valley. But the cost was buried under that red dirt. 1933 feels like a different world now. It's been nearly a century, long enough for history to start sounding like folklore or the plot of a black and white movie. It's easy to dismiss it. It's easy to say that curses don't exist, that stress kills men and static electricity kills dogs. It's easy to call it fiction, but the records remain. The Pocola Mining Company really did blast open that chamber. They really did find artifacts that hadn't seen the light of day in 500 years. And one by one, those men really did start to die. Some call it a tragedy of the Depression. Some call it a coincidence. But there are others who look at the facts, the unexplainable infections, the terror in a locked barn, and they choose to believe. Because the scariest stories aren't the ones made up for movies. They are the ones that actually happened.